Now 2019 has probably been the craziest year of my life, just looking at the traction alone on YouTube. I mean, we've tripled in size here, so thank you again for you guys for just making this an amazing year. And with an amazing year also comes an amazing year of watches, and watches that I've been able to review and handle throughout the year. So what I wanted to do, looking back now, my favorite watches of 2019 that I've had the opportunity to review. Okay, so now for this video, just for a little bit of structure here, what I wanted to do, instead of just having a list of my personal favorites, I will also include that at the end. Also have different categories where watches can be representative of those different categories, like best diver watch, best dress watch. And what I'll also do is, just to not have the Seiko versus the Patek Philippe going head to head with one another, I'll have a budget option as well as going for a luxury option for each one of these categories for wherever it might be appropriate. There's some instances where it might not be. And I also wanted to add a little more drama, so watches that I personally own, I don't want to necessarily just put right at the front or be the only watches that I mentioned, because that would make this list kind of boring and expected. So we're going to be looking at watches that I don't necessarily own and want to feature as great watches that left an impression this year. And then one final point of consideration, all the watches that are being mentioned in this video, I've done a complete review on. So that's kind of the criteria here. If I've just handled it or I've discussed it this year, I just wanted to be able to have a good cutoff point of what is really eligible here. And all links to the videos where I go in full depth on these watches will be in the description. Now to start out, I wanted to look at the best, or my favorite diver watches of the year that I have reviewed. And going into the budget category, at the beginning of the year, I did a review of the Orient Mako 2. And at that time, there was a lot of rumblings about the Orient Komatsu and the Kano. And at that time, there wasn't really much clarification on what those watches were. Were they going to be the Mako 3 and the Ray 3, or were they the standalone pieces, which we then figured out that they were. But at that time, I kind of just made the claim that the Orient Mako 2 and you could say the Ray 2, I reviewed the Mako 2, was a very compelling offering with the rising prices in Seiko divers like the SKX, as well as the increased offering that we saw from Orient. I thought for around $100, and I think this still stays true today, this is a very compelling offer. You're looking at a 41.5mm case, 47mm lug to lug, so very wearable. I think it has a clean design. I think if they combine the indices of the Ray 2 with the hands of the Mako 2, that'd be, I think, the perfect $100 diver watch that you could really find. And I think everything that I said about it at the beginning of the year still remains, and maybe is even more true now, considering just a lot of the trends that we were seeing with the increased prices continuing going up for Seiko, and just the value of a lot of those watches and affordable watches that commonly are mentioned in this kind of affordable price tier for divers have just continued to go up. I think it's just allowed the Mako 2 to continue to be a very viable option in the affordable range for around $100. So I think for best budget diver watch, that is a watch that I think still stays true, and that was one of the first reviews, maybe the first review that I did all year. Moving into the luxury category, I wanted to look at a watch that I think I've made some pretty bold claims about, just liking a lot, and one that I think is just very underappreciated as a result of the other watch that it's commonly paired with. It was brought into the world at the same time as the Tudor Black Bay, and the watch we're talking about is the Tudor Pelagos, a watch that I made the claim that it's my favorite offering from Tudor's current catalog. As to me, I love the titanium case. I love just how the watch just really embodies the brand ethos of creating tool-centric, military-issued dive watches. I mean, that's really part of what Tudor's heritage is, and I think it really does resemble it. It's not perfect, and I think part of why it's not perfect is, of course, the case sizing and just the limited options that are available, but it's a watch I'm strongly considering for my next purchase. I love the ETA version for just being a little bit thinner, but we'll see. I'm kind of just holding out for 2020 Baselworld just to see what will happen. I think if we see another case variant available, the Tudor Pelagos might be catapulted into a range or an area where it's strongly considered along with the Black Bay. But from Tudor's point of view, they've just put so much of the resources behind the Black Bay and offering so many different variants that I do think there's so much room to play with the Pelagos, and that's why I find it so compelling. That's why I'm so drawn to it. So our next category of watches here are pilot, aviation/travel watches, as I think that's a good category to summarize this. And for the budget tier, I wanted to look at Laco and Stova. I think Laco and Stova both represent kind of good history in this Flieger style watch. I've done an entire in-depth review of the just history behind Flieger watches, particularly Laco and Stova as being two primary pillars in that. So I can link to that video down below. But for Laco, I think they do offer something at a more affordable tier for a lot of people. So around $400, you're getting their Augsburg, which has the traditional Type A style dial at a $400 price tier. You're getting a Miyota movement inside of it, but I think you're still getting a lot of just offering there that somebody would want to expect from that type of watch. And then in addition to that, going a little bit higher up market, you have two other watches that certainly left an impression on me, the Stova Classic Flieger, and then also the Laco Heidelberg. And being two of the 5 brands that actually developed military-issued Beaver watches during the World War II. Now for the luxury choice of this category, I'd be looking at the Black Bay GMT. We heard the same kind of criticism. Is it too thick? How does it wear on the wrist? I wish it was smaller. I think a lot of that stays true with my impressions of it, but I think a lot of that was overblown. And I think as we continue to see the Pepsi GMTs from Rolex continue to go higher up market, I mean, we saw these things just skyrocket this year in price. They've come down a little bit that I've noticed looking at different sites selling them, but still very out of this world type of pricing. So I think it makes this offering very compelling. You're getting an in-house caliber, Pepsi GMT, isolated hour hand, and I think just really clean looks that fit that Black Bay profile pretty well. There's a lot of Black Bays that I think are just kind of forced. This one felt very authentic. It felt real. I loved it on the wrist. I did a really cool review side by side against the Planet Ocean GMT, and this one really did stand out this year. Another one that needs to be considered is the Rolex GMT Master 2 116710. So this is the green hand black dial GMT. I looked at a lot of different GMTs this year. I did a whole video overseeing just all the history of the GMT Master. But I think this was one that I've had to consider here just because I think it's underappreciated. And then also I've done an entire full in-depth review this year. So that would be kind of an honorable mention there. But I think both of those very strongly considered for the luxury tier of Pilot aviation style watches. Okay, so now for my favorite chronographs of the year. There's two that really come to mind that went head to head, and then there's one additional one that I did more recently in a review. Two Junghans watches, the Maximo Chronoscope that I of course mentioned many times on this channel, so you guys know the deal there. Just a lover of the design of that watch. It speaks to me. I've owned it for 3.5 years or however long now. It might be coming on 4 years now. So a lot to say about that watch, but I've said it in many other videos. But the other watch that I paired the Maximo Chronoscope against was the Meister Telemeter, a watch that I think has amazing, just retro 1930s vibes. There's just something about Junghans watches that really just resonate with me greatly, and those were two standouts. Another watch more recently that I mentioned was the Omega Speedmaster Racing. You have 14 different dial variants. I decided to review a white dial variant. I think a lot of things that I found compelling about it was all of the Speedmaster reduced talk, that something a little bit different that looks and kind of strays away from what we know with the Speedmaster Professional. The Speedmaster Racing provides. There's so many different color variants to choose from. You're getting a coaxial escapement, so basically an updated version to what the Speedmaster Reduced was offering when it was conceived a few decades ago. And then what you're also getting is just a ton of variety that also wears on the wrist pretty well. For so smaller wrist guys, you don't have many options when it comes to the Speedmasters. I find many of them wear a little bit bigger than I would like. I think it still works for a lot of smaller wrists if you're looking at the Man on the Moon watch, but I do like what the Speedmaster Racings are providing. It was a standout for the year. They're still, not perfect. The date changing function is a little bit wonky, a little weird, but everything else about the watch I think really stood out for me, so that also has to be one to consider here as well for this year. Now for the next category, watches that I gained more appreciation for. And whenever I'm if you go to my inbox and my email all day, I'm just getting bombarded by brands trying to get me to review their watches. And one brand that I was very quick and receptive of in terms of saying yes was, because I was just curious, was Traska. I saw their free divers. I thought they were interesting. They have these really cool mint dials. So I was like, all right, they're coming out with the new watch. Let me give it a shot. Can I give it away as a giveaway? And when doing a review on that watch, I have to say I was really impressed with that watch. I think a lot of it's just the nature of microbrands. I mean, my bar for expectation is sometimes lower than what to expect from, say, some of the more major brands. But I was just overall really impressed. For around $400 to $500, you're getting a really wearable, clean blue dial was a variant that I chose. But I think the most impressive thing for me was and just an avenue of classification or criticism that is often not considered when looking at watches is the case treatment. That watch really excelled in that category. On the Vickers hardness scale, we're looking at 1200 HV, so that's right on par with the heavily treated Zinn watches, the Damasco watches, but you're getting it for around half the price. So in terms of the luxury tier of watches that I gain more appreciation for, one that comes to mind is the Rolex Sky Dweller. And the Sky Dweller is a watch that, when you're looking at it from the outside, it looks like a watch that's just so garish and kind of, it's just something that evolved from that era of just oversized watches and like 2012 when it came out. Like thinking about the norms then, thinking about the trends then, you just think of it as like a big watch that is just there for someone that wants to flex. But when looking at the watch closer, and I think it's a watch that I think everybody should do their due diligence on before coming to a judgment on it. It's just a really actually interesting watch, and probably one of the more complicated watches next to the Yachtmaster 2 that Rolex makes, with perhaps one of the coolest uses of a bezel I have seen on a watch. So it's an annual calendar, and the bezel is directly able to engage the movement. So you're looking at a 9000 series movement within these watches. That it's pretty spectacular how you're able to, just changing and twisting that bezel, engage the movement and adjust to different parts of the annual calendar display. And despite from its looks looking very just kind of ostentatious and just in your face, it's very much more than that. I would love to see just smaller variants. I don't know how that would necessarily work with the calendar ring on the inside with just the proportions of the dial, but a really interesting watch, and I think one that I definitely gained some more appreciation for after spending some considerable time with it. Now the next category is watches that either underwhelmed me or didn't really speak to me. And one that came to mind is a watch that I reviewed it pretty straight up. I liked the watch in terms of just its relative offering, what it was able to provide for the brand, paving the way for new in-house calibers, having an open case back, for which this brand is kind of unique. And that's the Tudor North Flag. There's really, in terms of anything critical that I could make other than just personal observations and what I think of the watch, I can't really criticize it any more than the fact that I think it's not a very good looking watch, and it's not something that I would personally wear. Out of all the other Tudor watches that I have reviewed on the channel, I've reviewed pretty much most of the main offering of Tudor. This is the one that just kind of left me just feeling pretty flat. Again, not a bad watch, but just didn't do anything for me leaving away. I was not compelled for a second to make that watch my own, but I think for the right person, it's certainly a good option. It's a tool watch. That's what it is, and I think it does have roots within Tudor's brand, and again, paved the way for a lot of just new discoveries and new, probably this new perception that we have of Tudor probably would not be there if it wasn't for the North Flag and what it was able to bring forth for the brand. The other watch that I think it was more just underwhelming, and I think it's so much associated with the hype of the brand and so much associated with just the Calatrava line in general, but why I think the Calatrava 5119J underwhelmed me a bit was just the competition in the price tier. I reviewed a ton of different watches, handled a ton of different watches this year, and that entry-level, high horology, luxury dress watch tier, it's very competitive, and I think despite loving the design, loving just that hobnail bezel, it's classic, it's forever, there's something so timeless about it, but I couldn't help but think, is this really worth the money? The entire time I was reviewing it, you're getting a decades-old movement. I mean, in this $12,000 to $20,000 range, there's just a lot of competitive watches in that tier. I mean, you're looking at the Vacheron Patrimonies of the world, you're looking at the Longa Saxonias, and so many of the different watches available within that range. And I think you can also just look at the JLCs of the world for half the price, or the Glashütte Originals for half the price, which in my mind kind of almost even beat out the Patek Philippe if you just take off the actual name on the dial. Provide a lot more in terms of their complexity, more updated spec, as well as giving you more value for money. So I think for me, it was a little bit underwhelming. I like the watch, but I think more of what that was just a thinking about the whole of the industry and what's available at that price tier. Okay, so for the next category, we're looking at favorite giveaway watch of the year. And I've given away dozens of watches this year. I gave away 3 watches last month, and one of the watches that were given away last month was the watch that I think left the greatest impression on me in terms of just the best giveaway watch, and that was the Zodiac Super Seawolf 53 Compression Blackout Edition that I just reviewed, so link down below. But I was just really impressed with overall Zodiac this year. We saw the aerospace GMTs that were unveiled at Baselworld, and just throughout their entire catalog this year. I've just like what Zodiac is doing, focusing on the right designs, bringing back cool new iterations of it, like this particular iron plated, which in a lot of cases, like this DLC, PVD, IP kind of plated watches, in my opinion, sometimes kind of fall flat, but I think this one worked really well when comparing with that kind of green, bluish accented hands. That it wasn't overdone, but it was just a nice pop of color on a really just black surface of course, the dial, but also the watch itself. And I think Zodiac as a whole, part of the reason why I think it left such an impression. I was excited to be able to review one of their watches. There's a lot of history in the Seawolf line, and I think it's probably one of the most underappreciated dive watches in its legacy ever, being introduced in 1953, right alongside the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, as well as the Rolex Submariner. Now for the next category, best dress watch. And looking at dress watches this year, I really just covered luxury dress watches. So looking at two of my favorites here. When I was originally coming into this year, and when I was looking at a couple reviews, I mean, JLC is one of my favorite brands in general. I was a big fan of the Master Ultra Thin Moon, and handling it in person, none of those thoughts faded whatsoever. Doing a review of it after weeks of wear, nothing faded in my opinion of that watch. But one watch that I reviewed that elevated this year was a really fun watch. There's so much history involved with it, but there's something about it that really resonated with me, and that was the JLC Reverso Tribute Duo Face. So this was a particular line that was released earlier this year as kind of a build-on of what their Small Seconds tribute was with the blue face last year at SIHH 2018. But there's just something about that watch, and I think just dual faces in general, I think as a purist point of view, thinking about the history of the Reverso, I think the stainless steel back, staying true to what it was originally constructed to do, is help with the bashing of the glass crystal on the front of the watch during polo matches. Has a lot of purists thinking that, yeah, that's the kind of the epitome of the Reverso, but for me, there's something in this new age of enthusiasts that I just love the duo face a little bit more. And I talked a little bit recently with Kevin O'Leary in an upcoming video that I have about just the two different feels that the different dials give. This one had a really cool, just simple sub-second blue dial. It was amazing, just the applied indices, the sharp angles on it. You get it close with the macro lens. It looked fantastic. And then this really textured, finished white dial with just a dual display. Had the cool just trigger release on the top of the case when you pull it from the chassis. It was just an amazing watch. It spoke to me so much. It was simple, it was elegant, but it had two totally different looks. And I think it just epitomizes what I think the Reverso is, a watch that is the ultimate conversation starter, and is one that I think any wearer or owner of can just get so much enjoyment from. So that was a big standout and elevated on my list, even past the Master Ultra Thin Moon. And then also another watch that I think needs to be considered here for me, probably my favorite review of the year was of the Vacheron Constantin Historique American 1921. Love that watch, the history behind it, kind of opening the door for the American market, being a drive watch. It's kind of quirky, it's different, it's kind of weird, but it's so Vacheron, it's so unique. You see it from across the room. It's a design that I've always loved. I think it's interesting. It creates such conversation. And I think when you can do that, and it's kind of funny because you say both of these watches bringing forth as great conversation pieces, they're still so elegant in the way that they're executed. So those are just two standout pieces for me. Love dress watches, always will, and those were two ones that really, really left an impression this year. The next category, best everyday watch. And what I classify an everyday watch is a watch that can handle every daily scenario that you kind of throw at it. It has a good enough water resistance, so 100 meters of water resistance, robust in its ability to be worn in different locations. Can it be dressed up? Can it be dressed down? Now, starting with the three different tiers here, the budget tier, the watch that stood out the most was the Orient Maestro. We hear about the Orient Bambino, we hear about the Orient Diver watches, but this was a watch that I think walked that fine line between the two. 100 meters of water resistance, you're getting an in-house caliber for around 150, 170 bucks, a few different dial options to choose from. And another thing that I found was really compelling with this, along with it being just an everyday piece, it looks clean, it's simple, but I think what I get asked all the time are what are some viable alternatives to the fashion watches of the world that always are bombarding our social media feeds, people that maybe are into watches, just what's a good kind of first jumping off point for them to jump into this hobby and getting a mechanical watch. A lot of the Seiko 5s, and you can say Seiko 5 is a great alternative, but it doesn't provide the same level of like design and style that I think like say like a Daniel Wellington does. I think this watch, the Orient Maestro, does that. Plus you're getting an in-house caliber, 100 meters of water resistance again, and a really just viable price tier for a watch with a clean look. I think it was a watch that was a no-brainer for me. And I think for a lot of people, it might be a more viable option than the Orient Bambino. I think the Orient Bambino has a little bit more substance to it. It's got more personality. It's got more of an offering associated with it. But Orient Maestro, a great watch that I think should be considered more frequently in that affordable tier. Going to kind of the next, say, tier here at around $1,000 for an everyday watch, I think it's easy for me. The Sinn 556. Love these watches. I did the Sinn 556i and then the IB, so the IB with the blue dial and the traditional I with that black glossy dial. I'm pretty split on which one I liked a little bit more. After getting to wear them for around a month each, kind of going back and forth, I think the traditional glossy black dial with the Sinn 556i was just my choice for being a compelling watch. You're getting top grade, chronometer grade movements. Sinn, very meticulous with their testing. Very wearable, case size as well, around 38 millimeters. Of course, a well across the wrist with this lug to lug around 45 millimeters. Also, you're getting some pretty incredible bracelets on them. They're versatile as hell, and I think, again, are just great options for $1,000 for an everyday watch for pretty much taking on every scenario. And then just to throw in one more just watch that I think can fit this mold, I put it up against the Rolex Datejust as a nice comparison video as two of my favorite watches, but I wanted to highlight it because it really was a standout winner for me, the Omega Globemaster. This particular variant with the white dial pipe hand design, you have that amazing tungsten fine bezel, 39 millimeters in this case, 100 meters of water resistance. You're getting a coaxial movement. What really more can you say about this watch? And also, just being a lover of the Constellation line, I think this is a great representation of kind of bringing this Constellation line into this new era. I'd love to see more effort put on this end by Omega to offer even a fraction of what they do for the Seamaster as well as the Speedmaster in terms of new iterations and limited editions. I'm not saying put out a ton of limited editions of the Globemaster, but just give us some different case sizes or different maybe looks and colorways. Could be really fun. I think this is something that I would love to see, and the Globemaster was a watch that certainly left an impression on me this year. Now, the second to last category, before I go through my 10 watches that I just really enjoyed this year as my top 10, no particular order, favorite Microbrand watch reviewed this year. I think there's two that come to mind. One is the Traska Summiteer, like I already mentioned, just impressed with the case finishing, the style. Really liked it. You could tell there's a lot of attention to detail with everything that was done with that watch. And then the other watch that I think from a Microbrand point of view that I really liked was the Notice Retrospect 2. Overall, just like the look of the watch. I think it's fresh, it's cool. It's a well-done Microbrand. And just when you talk to certain just owners or founders of Microbrands, you're easy to pick up the people that are doing it for the right reasons and the wrong reasons. And every single Microbrand that I've covered this year, I thought were people that did it for the right reasons, but those two watches stood out for my own personal taste. And I think for this $400 to $500 price tier that they represent, a tier that sure is still a good chunk of money, but also is manageable for those that want to make it happen. And it's a nice kind of range in which if you want to complement your collection away from just the constant main brands that maybe occupy it, two viable options this year that for my personal taste, I really liked. All right guys, so here are my top 10 watches, and I actually have them on my phone here so that I just wanted to list them out so it's easy. So I had the Rolex Explorer 2 16570, which I'm wearing right now. Of course, that's a watch, and the Maxwell Chronoscope. There were two that I reviewed this year that are on there, but let's just keep those out of it. So 10 other watches that really left an impression on me this year. The Vacheron Constantin 1921 said everything that needs to be said about that watch. It's elegant, it's so of the period, and it's just so Vacheron. And I love the look of it. It's eye-catching while being elegant. The Omega Globemaster, an amazing watch that I think is just overlooked completely when compared to the other players in that kind of range for everyday watches. The Tudor Pelagos, still waiting out on Baselworld 2020 to see if there's new case variants available, but that 42 millimeters wears much better than I think what a lot of people let on with that titanium case. I think that's something that people don't consider. How heavy is the watch on your wrist? If you have a smaller wrist, certainly something to consider a little bit more. And then 3 JLC watches. I've done a couple reviews. I did a whole review of the Master Collection series as well as the Reversos. A lot of Reverso standouts. But the 3 watches here that we had were the JLC Reverso Tribute Duo Face. Again, mentioned that earlier in this video, having 2 completely different feels with that blue dial and there's the white fine finishing on the other reverse side. The JLC Master Ultra Thin Moon, that was already a personal favorite of mine, only furthered after extensive time with it. And then also the JLC Master Ultra Thin Perpetual. And what makes that watch so compelling, the stainless steel option, you're getting less than $20,000 perpetual calendar from a watchmaker like JLC. Perhaps one of the best deals for a perpetual calendar from, say, a high horology brand, and just beautifully executed. Also the Doctor Strange watch, which is kind of cool for any Marvel fans out there. The Zen 556, just a lover of the Zen 556 for some time. I always just look back at recent purchases or past purchases. I purchased the Zen 104, but if I had to pick again what watch from Zen that I think would be perfect for me, the Zen 556. Great everyday watch, over-manufactured, 200 meters of water resistance, top grade, chronometer grade style movements that, of course, within Zen's own house are testing to standards, well within cost parameters, and I just love the looks. Very simple, but very well done. And then finally, a couple other watches. Seiko Sarks 033, a watch my brother owns. I own the Sarks 045. I love what the Sarks just line in general has to offer. Very overlooked, I think, with all the people just constantly buying the Sarbs out there. Wanted to be a little different, but also wanted to see what else was out there. These are JDM models, but I would even say my brother owning the Sarks 033, I recommended it to him, and I think I gave him a better recommendation than even myself. Really clean, amazing looking watch that translates well in pictures even further, and also in person, of course, as well. Another last 2 watches, we have the Nomos Club Campus Neomatic. This is the Midnight Blue. Fantastic, amazing, just use of color. And the Nomos Club series, I think, is another great just consideration for an everyday watch. I love Nomos in general. I think you guys all know that. And then one final watch I want to have here is the Mito Ocean Star Tribute. Love the look of the watch, very wearable. Problem with a lot of the Ocean Star watches for me was always how they wore on the wrist. Larger, kind of blown out 42 millimeters for a lot of them. This one at 40 millimeters, as well as a very wearable lug to lug around 47 millimeters, and you're getting a Powermatic 80-hour power reserve movement. A lot to like about this watch, love the look, and it was a fun review to do. I went to Spain to review that watch during like a Red Bull cliff diving event, and ultimately one of my favorite watches that I reviewed this year. Well, all right guys, those are my watches that left an impression on me this year, my favorite watches of 2019 that I reviewed. I'd love to see just in the comments below your top 5 watches that you either purchased this year, watches that maybe you went into a boutique and tried on, or just experienced some way this year in the comments. Love to see that. And also to anybody that just made this year possible, 2019 has been such an amazing year, and one that I'll remember forever. And for anybody that's been a viewer, a subscriber, or anybody that just crossed paths with me along the way, I just want to say thank you for making this possible. I get to do something that I love every single day, and you guys make that possible. So thanks again. I really do appreciate it. If you guys are new here and you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Also, if you're in the market for a new watch strap, no better place than Bob's Watches and TeddyBaldassarre.com. So head down in the links in the description. A great way to support the show as well. So guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.